This is Duke University.
My name is Andy Bush. I work at Vassar College. I split my time between Hispanic studies and Jewish studies. Hispanic studies is where I started at Vassar. I've written some things in that field. Jewish studies came into being about 10 or 12 years ago, mostly pushed by a group of faculty, seconded by a group of students. I was the first director of the program. And the work that I do in Jewish studies. Lately, I've been the editor, co-editor with Deborah Dash Moore and MacDonald Moore of a series called Keywords in Jewish Studies at Rutgers. And I wrote the first volume for that series, where the key word was Jewish studies itself. So the book is called Jewish Studies, a Theoretical Introduction. I can hardly believe I'm about to do what I'm going to try to do. Maybe I'll start with an apology to all of the wonderful speakers in these 2 days. I guess that means that the thanks will come as we go down the line. I'm sure that I certainly can't cover everything, but more I'm concerned that no doubt I will respond unevenly. That's unfortunately a kind of double injustice, both to the quality of the presentations and to my esteem for all of you who I really learned from in these 2 days. But that and lots of thanks to everybody involved in setting up this conference. Eric Myers welcomed us with blessings. And then Jonathan recited the Shema. Hear well, he enjoined us, which was a mighty responsibility, the beginning of a conference, I think maybe the beginning of theory, with Elliot having just spoken. Then I have to anticipate that the ending will also have something to do with hearing. When at the end of the dinner I heard Jonathan sort of calling out from the far side of the room that I want to hear all the conversations. I understood that to be a messianic wish. It sort of increased, however, the responsibility. Maybe the saving grace here is that I do believe that it is not my responsibility to complete the task, but not mine to desist from it. I might start sort of where the conversation just ended a few moments ago, with the exchange about the canon, and to think of changing of generations, a generation that dominated Jewish studies, that lived through the experience of the war and the Holocaust. What was my strongest impression yesterday was how much Jewish studies now responds to a new political situation. Hanan said in the question and answer following his paper, in Israel today, the question of Jewish sovereignty is the main question. It seemed pretty clear yesterday. It's the main question for Jewish studies too. The weight of sovereignty, Jewish sovereignty, was so palpable throughout the day, I thought. Sovereignty as a fact, Martin had said in one of the question and answer periods, the antagonism is a fact, you said. So a fact, but also a factuality, now thinking of Svetlana's gloss of Benjamin's factuality as experience. And I would then even say that one of the ends of theory would be to theorize that relationship between fact and factuality. And I think we heard a lot of that yesterday. To say that, though, is, of course, also to invoke Benjamin, who did just that in his essay, The Storyteller. What I understood from the response to the weight, what I'm calling the weight of sovereignty, is that, thinking of Jonathan's introductory words, we might have seen theory as a ritual for resolving that main question of Jewish sovereignty. The resolution, I thought, came yesterday in the form of several interrogations, theoretical interrogations of Jewish sovereignty. The first was introduced to us by Sela through the work of Judith Butler, a very important interlocutor throughout the day. Butler provided the term cohabitation. Sela contested seeing it as a kind of alienation, or again to think of Svetlana's terms yesterday, an estrangement from the world. Remember, she distinguished estrangement from and into. So an estrangement from the world in a very specific sense, that is, that for Hannah Arendt, the world is politics. It's the space of politics. That's the understanding of the world. So to have taken a term that Butler derives from what you might call the verdict of the banality of evil book, to have taken a term from the world of politics and to lead it into ethics, because cohabitation is not a political term in Butler's analysis, so much as it is her politicization of Levinas's ethics. So to move from politics to ethics sounded to say like a kind of alienation. I would add there that the ethics is very explicitly through cohabitation. Levinas as an antidote to what Butler takes to be a shortcoming in Buber's ethics. And then I would want to say that there are several difficulties. One is at the base, perhaps, of all of them, the difficulty of hearing that Jonathan set as our task. How to hear politics and ethics. I would say, thinking of some of the terms that came up yesterday, not as analogy. We heard a lot of critique of analogy or analogous thinking. Not as allegory or symbol. Not as opposition, and also not as similarity. I thought that Martin provided us with a wonderful theoretical language. We could say that politics and ethics are linked. And I want to continue to think about what that linking might be. Second difficulty is Sela was concerned with what she saw as a misreading of Arendt. That didn't trouble me nearly so much as I thought there was a misreading by Butler of Levinas. Cohabitation is a reciprocal term, and Levinas's ethics is very decidedly non-reciprocal. Again, I thought we had language for thinking about the non-reciprocal yesterday, when, for instance, Sela in her autobiographical preface said, Jews were offered hospitality. That's the word I want to underline. Hospitality by the Ottomans. And then Martin saying, knowing is an offering of hospitality to links. Boy, I hope I never forget that one. Knowing is an offering of hospitality to links. Well, as for Sela's remark on hospitality, I want again to return once more to Jonathan's opening remarks. He had, in fact, offered a critique of cohabitation before the term even showed up in conversation, when he asked, why does Butler seem to limit the other of Jews to non-Jews? You asked Jonathan about, what about other Jews? And I think important, as part of the question about the canon, to note that certainly we've heard a lot more about Ashkenazi Jews than anybody else in these 2 days. There are others. We heard surprisingly little about gender. In the Jewish context, we might think of the othering of women. So Sela offered us an opportunity to think of other Jews. Then about Martin's remark about hospitality, I would say it provided an epistemology for Jewish studies, a way of thinking about what knowing would mean in Jewish studies as a kind of linking. One more difficulty comes from Hanan's paper. That is, we might also want then to ask, hearing, does Levinas really hear Buber well enough? What he seems not to hear is Buber, the storyteller, which you helped to restore for us. Storyteller of a different other, the Hasid as other, for his German-speaking audience. Once we get to the storyteller, so here my link back to Benjamin, want now to re-invoke estrangement into the world. Because what we saw in the discussion of Buber as storyteller was that kind of estrangement, the formation of what Svetlana called alternative community, what Martin, speaking about Lowenthal in the morning, called new community of belief. I think those were his words, right? Not yours. But then you also followed it up with what might be the good guy, bad guy version of it, the creation of cult-like communities on the one hand, and on the other, what Martin called friendship networks. So storytelling can do that work, can be an estrangement into the world. Svetlana spoke about lateral potentialities. And here, to be fair to Butler, she speaks often in parting ways of being to the side of things, would be another version of that lateralness. Introduced and exemplified when he started by telling us, why not enlarge Auerbach's project? That expansiveness, I would then say, had as its principal terms in yesterday's conversation, cosmopolitanism, also, that was Sela's word, vernacular cosmopolitanism, Svetlana, you had said, worldliness came up in relation to Heine, for instance, and again in relation to Auerbach. This expansiveness that becomes cosmopolitanism made me think that it would be well to remember that sovereignty was once intended to resolve the problem of cosmopolitanism, also understood as those cosmopolitan Jews, rootless, can't trust them. Cosmopolitanism was a problem. Sovereignty was going to be a resolution. What was the problem? Well, Constanti really spelled it out for us when he spoke about the unusual situation in which the narrative of the victims, the Jews in the Holocaust, their narrative, he said, has become the universal narrative, where universal clearly, in light of that website, doesn't mean everybody accepts the narrative, but that, as he also put it, it has become a universal trope of general suffering. That is, eliding the Jews. That's the problem. Eliding Jews in particular, but also eliding Jews as the bearers of particularity. Once we get to the matters of universal and particularity, we begin to move into what seem to me to be, if I might say, keywords in today's discussion. Leads me then to either a historical excursus or an excursus on history. It's set in motion in part by one of the questions that Elissa raised in one of the question-answer sessions yesterday directed to Yitzhak about the 19th century context. And Yitzhak outlined for us a 19th century context in which the key was Bildung. As we've heard at other times, but especially stressing that matter of the hierarchy and shame entering the conversation of Bildung because of a hierarchy. Bildung, we're not yet done with sovereignty because Bildung is the way that the sovereign self created itself through the telling of a particular kind of story. What I thought was especially useful was to remember that those stories are inevitably hierarchical. The notion of Bildung is hierarchical, and its twin, that is the story of the nation state, is hierarchical too, so that, for instance, in Jay's wonderful discussion of Kafka's Bildungsroman in the story, the report to an academy, we could add at least one more animal to the list. Remember that even there, the ape who undergoes the process of Bildung, the ape ends up with a chimp. Right? At the very end of the story, the ape gets a chimp to be ape to the ape. The shamefulness of those hierarchies stays with the Bildungsroman and stays with the histories of the sovereignty of nations. Part of Alyssa's question, I think, part of Yitzhak's response, is to set a historical context for the formation of what we call Jewish studies in the Wissenschaft movement, which is primarily historiographical. Maybe worth mentioning in light of those words universalist and particularist, that's part of the conversation there in the 19th century has to do with the reform movement seeing itself as being universalist in character. Oh, okay. And I'm still on day one. A 1 minute and maybe 15-second version of day two. Notions of history got complicated today, and so did notions of storytelling, both in the way that, Martin, you do history, but in your way of speaking about the possibility that the past is only a not yet foretaste of what will become. That's a line for messianism. And so when you said sparks of something that can be rekindled, I hear Benjamin hear the messianic imagery behind that. History got complicated. Storytelling got complicated in what Sarah had to say to us about Derrida and his response to another kind of community building in Levinas. I guess I'm going to run out of time. So final remark then would be to say we get in this new kind of storytelling, new kind of history, something like, for instance, Haviva's chart, what might be called a map of misreading. It looks a lot like Harold Bloom's charts. The history that we were told about the relationship of father and son in Levinas and Derrida is also germane there. It would help us, again, to think of relations within a canon formation, new genealogies and our relationship to what we might call tradition. And I guess I can't quite leave without saying that I appreciated in the final panel the way in which the refutation of refutation or negation of negation became a new way of speaking for a world that might be politics, a world that we might be estranged into, and one in which the coming of the Messiah, the day that we'll not only hear all the conversations, but be able to talk about them all, is still to be awaited. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Erin Carlston. I'm here at UNC in the Department of English and Comparative Literature, and also on the board of the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies. And Jonathan Friedman told me I'm allowed to do the shameless self-promoting plug, so I'm also most recently the author of Double Agents and its original subtitle, Jews, Homosexuals, and Communists in the 20th Century Literary Imagination, which gives you a better idea of what it's about than the subtitle that my editor imposed on me in the end. I prepared most of my remarks last night, where, as Andy says, it seemed after yesterday that we are at a point where it's apparently not possible to think about Jews and theory outside the very specific political moment and situation in Israel-Palestine. Then for much of today I was thinking, oh, yes, it is. And then by the end of the day I was thinking, no, apparently it's not. So I'm now mostly back to the comments that I wrote last night. And my theme is theory in the vulgar pedestrian sense as that which is opposed to practice. So I want to talk briefly, and I promise to try to keep it brief. I commend all of you who have made it since yesterday morning on your stamina. My theme is going to be not the ends of theory, but the beginnings of one kind of theory, Zionism as theory, distinct from and even opposed to a practical state-oriented Zionism at the end of the 19th century. So I was inspired here both by Svetlana's idea about the unexplored potentials in modernity and modernism, and Yitzhak Melamad's idea of the thought experiment, and in the spirit of Michael Chabon's Yiddish Policemen's Union, which for those of you, many of you don't know it, imagines a world in which Israel was founded in 1948, not in Palestine, but in Sitka, Alaska. He's imagining an alternative history and breaking up romantic notions about blood and soil or messianic ones about destiny to emphasize the radical contingency of history. And I want to think just a little bit about some roads not taken, both historically and in this conference, and invoke two names that are very rarely mentioned today in the context of Zionism and that have not come up at the conference. The names of Jacques Bahar and Bernard Lazare, two important figures in early French Zionism, before concluding with one very problematic outlier who has also not come up, and perhaps it's for the best, Otto Weininger. So very quickly, Jacques Bahar argued that what he called the historical personality of Judaism, which I love as a term, he said was a set of social precepts mandating liberty and equality. He believed that the project of assimilation for French Jewry was bankrupt, but his Zionism was really wedded to a utopian vision of Israel as a principle of justice and freedom rather than to the concrete hope of a Jewish state. Michael Maris, is that how you pronounce that name? Is it Michael Maris or Michael Maru? Does anyone know? Maris. Okay. Michael Maris has said that Bahar defined the essence of Judaism as an ideal of social justice which was in permanent protest against all existing societies. Bernard Lazare was an anarchist and thus opposed to all states, including a Jewish one. His Zionism represented concern for the oppressed, particularly the poor and the working classes, but also the value of what today we might call cultural diversity. He called it variety and defined it in aesthetic terms. He felt that variation made humanity more beautiful and that governments stifle variety. Like Bahar, he characterized justice as a specifically Jewish value, and he wrote, "I belong to the race of those, in Renan's words, who were first to introduce the idea of justice in the world. Every one of them, my ancestors and my brothers, had the fanatical wish," and that's interesting phrasing there, "had the fanatical wish that everyone receive his due and that the scales of the balance never be made to tip unjustly." Lazare describes Zionists as soldiers of justice and human fraternity fighting for universal freedom. So in sum, what we get in early French Zionism is typically this very idealistic anarcho-libertarian impulse that ends up really splitting from Herzl. French Zionists, like other Zionists, typically embrace the idea of ethnic specificity, the idea of Israel as a light unto nations, the city on the hill. But theirs was a highly abstract and cultural Zionism, which is not to say it was not also a political Zionism. It was. It just didn't confine its notion of the political to the nation state. And in fact, their vision of Jewish particularity and cultural values looks suspiciously like the ideals of the French Revolution. The valorization, obviously, of freedom, equality, and justice as the governing ethical principles of the ideal polis is very French. And this kind of theoretical Zionism really ended up designating French Zionists as the true heirs of the Enlightenment, recuperating a specifically Jewish tradition and identity in the service of French universalist values. So the historical irony is that Herzl's Zionism is, of course, provoked by the Dreyfus affair in France, where he feels like if Jews aren't safe in France, they're not going to be safe anywhere. But the French, both Dreyfusards and Zionists specifically, by and large, rejected Herzl's vision. So in 1899, Le Flambeau, which is the journal of libertarian Zionism, ran letters from Bahar and Lazar addressed to Theodor Herzl, in which the two of them resigned from the Zionist Action Committee because of what they considered the dictatorial, elitist, and colonialist direction of the organization. And Lazar wrote to Herzl, "You are bourgeois in thoughts, bourgeois in your feelings, bourgeois in your ideas, bourgeois in your conception of society." So that kind of covers it. I don't know whether this early French Zionism, and particularly Lazar, has anything to offer us today or not. But Melman's talk yesterday provocatively raised the idea that the apparatus of the nation state, and especially the militarized nation state, is in some sense not Jewish. It's a Gentile pleasure, right? Was it going nachis, right? Lazar suggests, in addition, that it's a bourgeois pleasure. And I would ask, is it not also a masculine pleasure? And I'm thinking about Daniel Boyarin's work on the kinds of oppositional masculinities that Jews ended up trading in the 19th century especially, in exchange for participation in bourgeois European culture and its norms of gender and nation. So trading, for instance, the image, the idealized image of the scholar for that of the soldier. And so that brings me around to Otto Weininger, and I hesitate to evoke this, archetype of misogynist, not to say insane, Jewish self-hatred. And yet I'm wondering if we can revalue some of Weininger's claims. For instance, when he said Judaism is saturated with femininity, presumably that was a bad thing for Weininger. But, as Andy was saying, there haven't been a lot of evocations of gender at this conference. We could perhaps have been a little more saturated in femininity. Weininger also argued that Jewishness was necessarily diasporic. He wrote, Zionism is the negation of Judaism, for the conception of Judaism involves a worldwide distribution of the Jews. Citizenship is an un-Jewish thing, and there has never been and never will be a true Jewish state. Again, I'm wondering if it is possible for us to try to revalue that claim and ask if there is some unexplored potential in that idea. And that's where I'm going to leave my comments.
I'm in comparative literature here at UNC. I just published a book about a year and a half ago on Gilles Deleuze and the Fabulation of Philosophy. It's volume 1 of 2, which is the douchiest move that you could possibly make. But I have a volume ahead to write. And I'm in the midst of editing a couple different books. I think that in part when I listened to most of what transpired yesterday, I was kind of convinced, and now I've reoriented, but I was convinced yesterday that there was something missing. And so when we talked beforehand to sort of strategize the places in which we would speak today, we found ourselves, at least the final three of us, thinking about a French tradition that had in some ways been maybe papered over or a little bit repressed yesterday. And in fact, I'm going to say a couple things, and I'm going to try to provide a kind of history that's quite polemical in some ways. So, but that's good at the end of a conference, and maybe it'll keep you awake.
The end of theory.
That's right. And in fact, I want to talk about schematically about the titular constituents of this conference, which is to say, Jews, theory, and to suggest that before we could inquire into the end of either of these, we need to understand the exigencies and contingencies that bring these terms together. So the first part, theory, the second part, Jews. So let me start with theory, since this element has by far, I think, the shorter history of the two. Now, I'm perfectly well aware that we could take the Greek theory all the way back to the Greek theoria, but the fact remains, and I think we all know this, so maybe you'll tell me otherwise, that theory is mobilized here, right, in the terms of that title, in a particular register, and that this register is particularly historicizable. After all, this is the kind of theory that was once rendered, and unironically, with a capital T, right? The kind of theory that operates without a modifier. This is not, in other words, social theory or literary theory or linguistic theory or film theory or political theory, post-colonial theory or psychoanalytic theory, and it's not even critical theory. Inasmuch as theory traverses all of these predicated categories, it's equivalent to no one of them. But perhaps we can risk going a little further here, since the attempt I'm about to make to historicize and categorize theory, what I want to suggest, I think, is that the attempt that we all make all the time to sort of to specify theory in this way, it suggests a kind of abiding predilection, which is to bring analysis to bear on the categories themselves, so that it's not the category that determines theory, it's theory that is reflected into the category. And what I really want to suggest, going back to, say, his talk and a couple of earlier talks from yesterday, is to suggest that the essence of what theory is about reflective judgment. Obviously, in a slightly modified sense from Kant, but I think that's, in other words, we're not talking about a universal that determines, we're talking about a particular through which we think the universal, and frankly problematize it. Okay, so having said that, I want to deal with what will probably strike some as the problem that I've just developed. The suggestion that theory ought not to be traced back, at least initially, to critical theory, I think raises eyebrows. At the very least, it seems to willfully ignore one of the most obvious and enduring points of departure for the genealogy of theory, namely the Frankfurt School. So let me be clear. I'm not saying that critical theory doesn't become a touchstone for theory, nor that the thinkers associated with that school aren't absolutely essential to the project of theory. Rather, what I'm saying is that the history of theory, and I mean especially as it came to be institutionalized in Anglo-American circles, which is where that unmodified theory takes shape, really begins with the reception of a particular French tradition, which we can probably define in terms of a great number of isms: structuralism, post-structuralism, as well as deconstruction, genealogy, all of which we find in the conference in 1965 at Hopkins, right? That's sort of the moment. I'm not saying that it's the most important moment, but it's a kind of trigger. Not unlike the British invasion, which roughly happens at the same time, this French invasion induced a kind of theoretical hysteria. And maybe we should speak of this word that Kant uses when he thinks of the French Revolution, Schwärmerei, right? The sort of enthusiasm. And it's that kind of enthusiasm from which readers today often recoil in embarrassment. I take Itzhak's description of this generation of predominantly French theorists yesterday when he said postmodern, in the sense that, say, Sokal and Brickman famously called postmodern theory fashionable nonsense, or perhaps the sense that Manfred Frank finally speaks of the devolution of neo-structuralism into semantic games and anarchic claims. I'm not in the business, obviously, of defending theory as such, but if we can't be more sympathetic, perhaps we can be more precise. So the first thing is just to take the two philosophers that were in play yesterday. I think, first of all, of Deleuze and Agamben is actually of different generations. And further, I would say I don't think of them as theorists, insofar as both come out of the traditions of philosophy one within France and one within Italy. And they're very, obviously established traditions. Now, when I say being more precise, I mean not only in order to disentangle the sort of lineaments and lineages that make up theory, but also to understand how particular lines of French theory became conduits for, and this is really my second point, they became conduits for the introduction of German theory and philosophy. I think it's an amazing thing to think about the fact that the French read the Germans. The Germans don't read the French. Not all, but it's to say something like, people have remarked recently that Sloterdijk, for instance, is one of the first figures in that tradition to really reckon with the French. And it's odd enough to think that Nietzsche has to go through a French tradition, and obviously an Italian one if you think about the edited, complete works, to come back to the Germans. Okay. Beyond this, I would say we only need to recall Foucault's discussion, right, when he's sort of trying to demarcate what theory is, and in some ways to demarcate what his project is, and we only need to recall that triumvirate of Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, right, that the French find those thinkers whose respective critiques of modernity the French mobilize in a series of what they call returns. So Althusser's return, Deleuze's return, Lacan's return, etc. Okay, so this takes us to the second part, and this is brief. Beyond this triumvirate, Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, and beyond the sense of talking about the national languages of philosophy, my point is that the institutional history of theory produces its own intellectual history, and that these two histories, though they exist in the present, actually move in opposite directions. The institutional history moves forward into the future. The intellectual history moves backwards into the past, where, hold on, I'll read my writing, where a great many of the thinkers whom we've discussed over the past 2 days, Freud, Simmel, I would have added Mauss, but Benjamin, Adorno, Arendt, Buber, Scholem, are claimed under the name of theory. It's important just to pause here and say the centrality of Jacques Derrida is so evident when you think about that sort of litany of thinkers, because he writes about almost every one of them, right? So he becomes in some ways this transfer point that's really, I think, very, very important. Having said that, it's worth remarking that many of these thinkers would not have recognized themselves in this category of theorist, or would have preferred another, but that I think such preference shouldn't prevent us from appreciating how the elasticity of the category of theory actually allows us to grasp a kind of uncommon or groundless ground that connects seemingly disparate instances. What links these figures, so many of them at least, not all, but so many, whether initially or eventually, is their indeterminable status within the disciplines and domains of knowledge. Right? I mean, they're not, you can't just say, where do you put Freud? I mean, even today, to think about this is an incredible problem. Like, I know that Freud gets taught in various places, but in some ways, he fits nowhere anymore. Even Simmel, when you think about where he's no longer taught in sociology in the way that he used to be. These are people that, in some ways, they either were to begin with, as Benjamin was, unplaceable, or they've now become unplaceable. Now, of course, we can thankfully say that they are taught in Jewish studies and in religious studies, but I think that the problem really goes beyond these kinds of safe havens, because the problem of this kind of theory lies in the reflective and reflexive relationship to the categories, which is to say the disciplines themselves, right? Insofar as I'm sort of suggesting that reflective judgment is what's at issue here, these thinkers, they reflect into the very categories or disciplines to which they would otherwise belong. And by problematizing them, they often fall out of them. Okay. So, as I said, Freud's psychoanalysis, Benjamin's literary criticism remain paradigmatic cases for the irreducible absence of a paradigm. Without a native soil, they lack a kind of disciplinary home. And I actually, just thinking back to the question of animals, I thought of this. It's probably for me the moment in Freud that has the greatest pathos. And he's writing this letter to Fliess, and it's at the end of the letters, and he's deeply, deeply discouraged. He feels like he cannot communicate psychoanalysis, that it doesn't communicate to him, and he says that he feels like Humboldt's parrot. And the references to this incredible sort of tale whereby these two warring tribes, one tribe basically finally almost kills the other off, and then does kill them off, but there's one last repository of this tribe's language, which is a parrot. So the parrot, which is purely a sort of automaton, right, is that's where the language is left. But the parrot can't communicate or gesture. It can only speak, and it can't speak or know what it's speaking. And Freud, he says, I'll give you the quote because it's kind of unbelievable. I've already resigned myself to being like someone who speaks a foreign language, or like Humboldt's parrot, being the last of one's tribe, or perhaps the first and the only one. These are quite similar situations. Yeah. So, okay, let me conclude. I'd be remiss if I didn't note here that almost every one of the theorists, the Jewish theorists I've named, was compelled in their own lifetimes to become an immigrant, a refugee, an exile, or an expatriate. And perhaps it's inevitable that we're faced in so many cases with the textual experience of dispossession and estrangement. And I think this has been a continual motif throughout the 2 days. This brought me, or induced me, to go back last night and look at Hegel's lectures on the history of philosophy, where he famously characterized Judaism by virtue of an intellectual and religious tradition based in an exclusive covenant that exists in the absence of a corresponding land. With the Jews, nature passes over to the foundation of the spiritual, but the spirit here, Hegel says, is entirely purified and as such stillborn. It's neither concrete, nor free, nor universal. To put it another way, the problem of the Jewish God is that he is abstract, compulsory, even jealous, and exclusive. So, and Hegel says that God's law commands the rule of a family. And he actually goes back and he's thinking about Spinoza. And he writes, Spinoza regards the code of Moses as having been given by God to the Jews for a punishment, a rod of correction. So, in some sense, it's Hegel. He's not the fan of Spinoza. I mean, respects him, but they're not.
It's very precise reading.
What?
It's a very precise
reading. It is in many ways, but it's not. Yeah, it's cherry picked. So, without, let me just sort of finish up here. Hegel's point is that what the Jewish law provides is the basis for a family, not for a sovereignty. And this is what Hegel says. He says, properly speaking, no political union existed. And he's thinking about the Jews even after the conquest of Canaan. He says, no political union existed. The state is an institution not consonant with the Judaistic principle. Okay. So without taking this declaration too far, it strikes me that we might revise and revalue this claim. Isn't it the case, after all, that the absence of sovereign ground is both the condition and the conclusion of theory? Where philosophy was underwritten as a project of the state, and we can think of Nietzsche's Philosophical Laborers, which he talks about in Schopenhauer Educator, without that sort of project of the state, perhaps theory begins from a feeling of statelessness, if not literal, then perhaps metaphysical. And it's at this point that you might cue the violins and usher in the image of transcendental homelessness. But actually my point is, I think, a little more devious. which is, if we are to speak of the end of theory, it would be wise to consider whether this is because, paradoxically, not that we don't have a home, but now actually having a state is compulsory. I don't mean merely because the constitution of the Jewish state exists and has made it so or made it possible, but because in the age of security, if one doesn't have a sovereign state, then one likely will be assigned a state or a state of affairs. This is, of course, the meaning of what an enemy combatant is. Okay, thank you.
I teach in English, American Studies, and Jewish Studies departments at the University of Michigan. I'm going to be really as fast as I can, so I'll just do telegraphically. Thanks. Thank you all. Okay. I'm kind of a rigger here in some sense. I was in the area. Jonathan Byron very kindly invited me to come to the conference and to join you and to comment on it a little bit. So I'm going to do that. I do feel a little funny because I really haven't thought very much about theory in sort of the high theory sense that's been circulating around, particularly today, since I went running, screaming from Derrida's limited ink talk at Yale when I was a scared first-year graduate student in whenever the heck it was, way back when. Luckily, though, a few years later, I had the great luck to pick up Martin Jay's Dialectical Imagination in the bookstore, and it led me back, or led me, because goodness knows my courses weren't leading me, to a world that really became very important in my intellectual development, the world of Frankfurt School of Thought, Benjamin Adorno, and so on. So thank you for that. Very great intellectual moment for me. And I think in this, I just want to thematize this by saying I think my experience was very similar to that of many people in my generation. I won't speak for most of them, in the sense that deconstruction was very important to us when we got to graduate school, but that Frankfurt School stuff became much more important to many of us as we moved along through it. It certainly did in my own work, and I think, but probably, easy to say, in the work of a lot of my friends who went off and became new discourses and so on and so forth. I think apropos of new historicism, though, the next big theoretical development among the folks that I knew and hung out with was the work of Foucault. And I think it's been really interesting that the name of Foucault hasn't really surfaced, to my knowledge, much in the proceedings today. I think it's really interesting because I think personally that Foucault has been the most generative of theorists in the academy today. I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but queer studies, queer theory, and disability studies and disability theory, both of which seem to me to be some of the most, represent some of the most vital places, along with Jewish studies, where work is getting done, come more or less out of theoretical interventions with Foucault. It's no wonder, though, that Foucault's name hasn't come up much among us, because Foucault is just really wacky on the subject of Jews, or rather really strange, because although his work is saturated with concerns about psychoanalysis, concerns about Marxism, concerns about power, concerns about discourse, concerns about the queer body, and so on and so on and so forth, Foucault really basically doesn't engage with Jews very much at all. His biographer, James Miller, says, oh yes, everything in Foucault is about Jews, and it's really important, and he talks about it all the time. And if you go back and look in the notes, which I am, as a pedant, always do, what do you find? He's citing an unpublished manuscript by a guy who knew Foucault in California. So I don't know. Maybe that's true, but go figure. It doesn't make much sense to me. As someone who's involved in the Jewish world and is kind of thinking about family secular issues right now in my own work, I've been thinking about how what might happen if one brought the Jewish context back to Foucault, and I think it'd be really fantastic and really interesting to sort of expand the ways in which Foucault and Foucauldian studies would develop. It's one of those weird ironies that is not really an irony that many of the finest students, many of the finest scholars who use Foucault in their work are Jewish and never mention Foucault's not mentioning of the Jewish. But it would be a very interesting, project indeed. I have a long quotation from Foucault that I was going to read to you, but I don't think I will because it's late. I think instead what I'm going to do is just talk about some of the places in which Foucault and Jewish studies come together, have come together, might more formally be brought together, and might be thought of in tandem with each other as a way of suggesting what the next ends of theory might be. Because after all, it seems to me that the question that's been bracketed throughout this conference has been, what next? What's coming? Where are we going to go? And I just want to sort of just put those questions very briefly on the table. One place that we might want to go is towards the retheorization of power. Jonathan Boyarin, who's just moved up to the second row here, in his book, The Unconverted Self, does all sorts of really great things to sort of suggest the ways in which biblical/textual power works in the context of the so-called New World and of the imperializing adventures therein, which he beautifully traces back to basically all the way back to the Second Lateran Council. I can't even remember which one. Fourth. There's a Lateran Council in there, but Jonathan, to the best of my memory, doesn't engage much with Foucault in his book directly. I just actually did a Google search on the book and found that there is one mention in one note. But it does seem to me that his work and Foucault's work profitably speak to one another in terms of thinking, as Foucault does not, about the many ways in which power and religion and textuality can all sort of interpenetrate each other. Queer theory is obviously another place where Foucault's work has been really generative for people. Aaron does a great job in Double Agents of sort of working out, again, not citing or invoking Foucault directly, or that I remember. Once. I was a reader for her book, so I get to say this. But Aaron does a really, really wonderful job of sort of tracing out the queer Jew thing that I've written about, that another Boyarin somewhere on some other coast has written about, that Sandra Gilman has written about and written about and written about and written about. But it seems to me to be a really, really, really powerful and important place where Jewish studies as a discipline and Jewish scholars have gone and will continue to go. And we wouldn't have gone there, frankly, if Foucault hadn't written. But I just want to conclude with what I think of as the next great conjunction, which hasn't happened yet, to the best of my knowledge, which would be between disability studies and Jewish studies. I really think that an idea of the abled and disabled body, which comes directly out of a lot of the ways in which Foucault was writing, and the stuff that people in disability studies are doing with that, is really fascinating and interesting. There's all kinds of really cool theoretical work being done there. There's all sorts of ways in which Jewish studies has talked about the body, the male body, sadly, ad infinitum, the female body, not so much, and the disabled body, I don't know. I'm sure there's some good work out there, but I see that as the sort of the next big conjunction. There are some interesting, cool young Jewish women, Rachel Adams at Columbia and Priscilla Gilman, who's used to be in the Academy and isn't anymore, who've been writing really fascinating life narratives about raising special needs kids, autistic kids in both cases. Autistic and Down syndrome kids in both cases. And so it seems to me that there's a real interest out there in Rachel and Priscilla's generation in trying to think about the experience of disability, sometimes in a Jewish framework, sometimes not. And I think that the theorization of that is the work that will be done, I hope, by that generation, and I hope in tandem with a truly vibrant and multiple world of Jewish studies. So that's what I have to say. Thank you all for listening.
produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.